Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. So here I am outside the house where William Wilberforce died. So you can see how tall it is. I'll try and put this thing right out, and it still doesn't do justice to it. So a very fine house and very spacious too. So William Wilberforce is best known for having done more to get slavery abolished than anybody else. Wilberforce was born in Yorkshire in 1859 into a prosperous family. His father was a timber merchant, buying timber, particularly from Scandinavian countries, selling it on in Hull, which was a major port, and Hull was trading with Scandinavian countries, anywhere in the Baltic, Germany, as far as Russia in particular. So a lot of shipbuilders needed this timber, and it was used for construction and other purposes. Some timber from the United Kingdom. So they were very well off. One of the most prominent families in Kingston upon Hull, to give it its full name. Hull, that is the river, sometimes known as the Humber. So the only river in the British Isles known by two names, so far as I can think of. So he had several siblings. He was brought up in the Church of England, and he remained a fervent Anglican all his life, until eventually became an evangelical Anglican. So you can be an evangelical outside the Church of England or inside. So for him, it wasn't just going through the motions. It wasn't just paying lip service. He was passionate about his faith and felt he had to put it into action. It wasn't simply a case of saying his orisons, showing up at church. No. It had to mean political action. What would Jesus do? It was that sort of Christianity. It was the right sort of what would Jesus do, as we shall see. Anyway, so he went to a public school in Yorkshire, is Yarm, if I got that right. I've been there years ago for a hockey match. And the only other famous person is some playwright to go there. I'm just trying to think who it is. Is it Peter Shaffer or one of those ones? One of those late 20th century British playwrights. Anyway, and then he went to St John's College, Cambridge, and he was a contemporary of Pitt the Younger, William Pitt, as in son of a man who'd been Prime Minister not so long before, Pitt the Elder. So the two got along famously, though they weren't at the same college. So Wilberforce was a Tory. Pitt the Younger came from a Whig family, more associated with the Tories later on, as we'll see. It's not quite clear, is he a Tory or not, or is he just a Pittite? And his acolytes, sometimes simply called Pittites. First of all, that was pejorative. Anyway, Wilberforce had himself elected for Parliament as a member for Hull, the constituency he was born into. So there were two members of Parliament for that borough. And of course, rather few people had the right to vote. Now, it might seem anomalous that he wanted slavery to be abolished, but didn't want to do anything about the rights of working class people, or indeed middle class people in the British Isles. He thought it was right that the property classes have the franchise, and most people should not have the right to vote. So bear in mind the French Revolution came along when he was 30. And he was not remotely sympathetic to that. There should be no revolution in this country. They shouldn't extend the franchise. Sedition should be firmly stamped on, all that. So perhaps it's incongruous. So he began to turn his mind to slavery, and he met Thomas Clarkson, another Cantabrigian, who was set an essay, Anne Liciat invitos servitatem dare. Is it permissible to enslave the unconsenting? Now, for Clarkson, first of all, this is a mere theoretical question. It was academic for Wilberforce too, but there were some black people in this country, seldom brought directly from Africa. Usually their ancestors have been kidnapped, they've been taken to the Antilles, held in servitude there, working on the plantations in the most hellish conditions, sometimes brought to this country from the 17th century onwards, but treated as a curiosity. But he began to meet such people, and they became human to him. Of course, they were always human, but up until that, they were far away. People knew nothing about them. Out of sight, out of mind, didn't care. Some people did know and still didn't care and were still barbarically cruel, not trying to sweep it under the carpet or excuse the abominable crimes of those who were involved in the slave trade. And so the Quakers, that unusual religious group, Christian group, they opposed slavery on principle from earlier on than this. and indeed in 1775 in the United States, an anti-slavery society had been founded. There had been some kind of anti-slavery movement here in the 1770s. He wasn't the founder of it, but later there were several anti-slavery societies. There's the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Now, it would be good to abolish servitude altogether, but one step at a time, because they faced vested interests. There were people who were very much entrenched in maintaining slavery, who'd made huge fortunes from it. There were many members of Parliament, peers, and other people of consequence, bankers and so forth, who really did not want to give this up. It was a source of the filthiest possible lucre for them. So they would say it was good, it was justified by the Bible. Haven't you read the book of Genesis, chapter 9, where the Lord made Ham a slave and his brothers Shem and Japheth over Ham forever after, and the people of Africa descended from Ham, so saith the Lord. So you can't argue that, or you're against Christianity. Indeed, the Church of England, of which he was a communicant, owned slaves. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, this Church of England organisation, owned these people, and they even had the word society branded into their flesh to mean Society of the Propagation of the Faith. This organisation, which was committed to evangelizing for Jesus Christ, owned human beings. So there were things like the famous Somerset case. James Somerset, who was in a pub, who'd been severely beaten up. His face was very bruised and swollen. And a man took pity and asked him, this black gentleman, what happened to you, and explained that his master had hit him very severely. And the man ran away, and there was a court case, and eventually came before the judge, Lord Mansfield, who said the black must be discharged, and said that slavery had been abolished in England and Wales many centuries before. Slavery was permitted in the colonies, but once someone who had been held in thraldom came to these shores, he was free. Scotland followed suit very shortly afterwards. I'm not sure when we did it in Ireland. So Wilberforce started indefatigably advocating for this. So some people say, oh, it's absolutely crucial for the economy, and you're so cruel because you would leave these people on a barbarian chieftain and they're cannibals and they might be gobbled alive by a lion. So we're really doing them a favour by abducting them and whipping them half to death and forcing them to work from dawn till dusk and raping them and things like that. They ought to be thankful. They're just ingrates if they don't want to suffer all these appalling crimes. That's just how ludicrous some of the pro-slavery rhetoric was. It was an exercise in polishing a turd. But anyway, it fooled people, some people here who wanted to be fooled. There's a great capacity for self-delusion, for telling ourselves that some categories of people are not people at all, that we don't have to have sympathy for us, that could be me. No, that doesn't apply, that they're different. I know we do it today about people in Syria, or we do it about unborn children or whatever. Whole categories are just not human. We can do anything to them, or we don't have to give a damn about what happens to them. I suppose it's a coping mechanism, because we wouldn't have a moment's contentment if we always felt sorry for people who are suffering. So back to Wilberforce. So some people said that slavery itself was acceptable, but how about the trade? It was difficult, even for the most stalwart advocate of slavery, to say that kidnapping people, and many people getting killed in the process, was acceptable. People taken across the ocean in the most appalling conditions, is that acceptable? The notorious Zong case, when a ship was running out of water, so they decided to have these people who were chained up just throw them overboard and leave them to die in the ocean, which they did, and then claim on insurance. And they won their case in the Guildhall court. The ship owners got the money off the insurance company, despite freely admitting the murder of hundreds of people, because that money was more important than the lives of these people. It was joined by others like John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace. John Newton was involved in the slave trade, was a ship captain, and estimated he'd shipped several thousand people into slavery. He was a nominal Christian, but one time a tempest was brewed up, and he felt that his vessel was going to sink, so he sank to his knees and implored the Lord to spare him. And he said that if Almighty God extended his arm and spared him from this storm, then he would become passionate about his faith, and indeed he did. But his Christian faith guided him to believe that enslaving people was an absolute moral outrage. So he became a zealous anti-slavery activist, and he composed that hymn, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, which became a staple of the anti-slavery movement. Was very popular in America. Well, to this day, Obama famously chanted it at the Charleston memorial after when that Charleston church was attacked by a racist. So back to Wilberforce. He was making some headway. The House of Commons even passed a bill about this, the abolition of slavery in the 1780s, but then it was blocked by the House of Lords because this revising second chamber of hereditary peers with their vast experience, the Lords spiritual as well, they were going to stop this demagogic nonsense if something is ill considered. No, it wasn't properly thought through, and delayed it by years. The American Revolution had intervened. All right, in the baker's dozen of colonies, slavery was going to stay there, and the trade. But finally, in 1807, he managed to have a law passed saying the slave trade is forbidden, the transatlantic trade. You can no longer kidnap people or indeed purchase Homo sapiens in Africa and take them by ship to the American continent. Those are already enslaved in the Caribbean islands or in India or anywhere in the British Empire. They remain in slavery, but nobody else can be kidnapped, because how can you say that's legal? Under what law entitles you to do this? Now, usually it was African nations lifting the sword against each other, and those who were vanquished were taken captive, and the captives were sold into slavery. Whites came and bought them, British people, Dutch, French, Portuguese, Spanish, even Danes, and shipping them to their colonies, occasionally actually keeping them as slaves in Africa. So slavery was nothing new. We've had a recorded history for 5,000 years. We had slavery in virtually every country, almost always. India briefly abolished it under Ashoka, came back, and one of the Iranian emperors or Persian emperors abolished it, but then it came back. So the Danes had abolished it just beforehand, and of course there was the US Virgin Islands. That was the Danish West Indies until 1917, when the United States purchased it. The Danes had some ports on the coast of West Africa, and they had a couple of towns in India. So the Danes were a seafaring nation. They didn't just have Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. So Wilberforce finally managed to get that law through Parliament. In 1808, the United States followed suit, and they prohibited the transatlantic slave trade, although trafficking people from one state to the next was permissible. So he had to move a mountain just to get that far. The Napoleonic Wars were raging, and Nelson, being the hero of the hour, of course, felled at his moment of victory in October 1805, and he'd been an inveterate opponent of Wilberforce, thought that Wilberforce was a complete charlatan and mountebank, and falsely posing as a saint. Indeed, Lord Nelson, he'd married a young widow who'd been married to a plantation owner in the West Indies, as in this woman's first husband had made money through slavery. That may have somewhat coloured Nelson's view. Didn't stop him having black sailors in his fleet. So on to Wilberforce, a real anti-revolutionary, as I pointed out. And then one of the other little-known things about him is he didn't quite believe in animal rights, but felt great mercy towards animals. Looked after many animals in his house, wounded animals, tried to alleviate their suffering too. But there seemed to be a bit of a moral blind spot about him. When he looked at the proletariat in this country, he said, no, we ought to have the patricians ruling, and that's how we should have no minimum wage, and if a servant breaches a contract, it ought to be criminal, whereas if the master breaches the contract, it ought to be a civil suit, and things like that. So no extending the franchise. It was completely against reform, like political reform of that nature. Anyway, he met a Barbara Spooner one time, and he and this young lady immediately fell head over heels in love. Only days later, he proposed to her. Now, and she instantly accepted. I know things moved faster in those days because the lifespan was briefer, and people didn't mess around. You have a serious relationship, you were respectable, you had to marry. Obviously, a child being born outside of wedlock was considered a disgrace. And so, but both sides, the friends of both of them, asked them to slow down, think about this. Are you being rash and hasty? But anyway, they would not to be talked out of it. And you had to post the banns a fortnight before you intended to get married. You couldn't meet and get married that day. You had to announce to the church at least 2 weeks in advance. And so they got married just 2 weeks after the proposal. However, they were blissfully happy, and they were blessed with a large race of children. They were fervent Christians, the children. And one of them, Samuel Wilberforce, he went on to be Bishop of Oxford. Soapy Sam, as he was dubbed by Benjamin Disraeli, who said that this man was insufferably saponaceous. Soapy Sam, who was one of the main opponents of Charles Darwin, famously, at that Natural History Museum in Oxford, Soapy Sam, he verbally crossed swords with Huxley, as in who was Darwin's bulldog, when he sarcastically asked Huxley if he was descended from a monkey on his grandfather or his grandmother's side. He was a bit puritanical, Soapy Sam, saying that any man who had ever acted on stage would never be ordained in the Diocese of Oxford. So the Oxford University Dramatic Society wasn't founded under him because the university thought we can't allow our undergraduates to act, otherwise they can't be priests of the Church of England in this diocese. They could do it in other dioceses, but obviously Oxford's a very notable diocese. But anyway, back to the father, back to William Wilberforce. So he had to hobnob and pull strings and had to be quite crafty in building his political alliance, and it was only with the greatest difficulty that this was going to happen. So many setbacks in advancing the anti-slavery movement. So he didn't live here very much. Mainly he lived just off Clapham Common. There's a Wilberforce house. I'm not sure if that's where he lived. They used to go to that church on Clapham Common, the Clapham sect, they were known informally as, this group of evangelical Anglicans. The Reverend Venn was the incumbent of that church. Zachary Macaulay, the Scots administrator of Sierra Leone, who'd been a vice manager of a plantation in Jamaica, and had actually participated in the wickedness of slavery and come to see the error of his ways, and others, Reginald Sharp, and on and on. So finally, in 1833, he was a very old man and very infirm. An act was passed which was going to abolish slavery throughout the British Empire, with a couple of exceptions, although the exceptions were eventually resolved too. But they couldn't do it immediately. Had to be abolished gradually. Such is politics, compromise. Of course, they wanted to abolish it instantly, but they just couldn't get that through the House of Commons, the House of Lords. It was just after the Representation of the People Act, 1832, commonly called the Great Reform Act. So a few more bourgeois people were enfranchised, and perhaps they were more anti-slavery than the upper class, and those who had the right to vote were almost all upper class until 1832. The electorate expanded from about 5% of the population to about 8% of the population. A few people even lost the vote in 1832 because it had been made standardized across every borough and every shire. Previously, the franchise had been a little bit different from one constituency to the next. So he was elated when he heard the news that finally it had been passed. It was going to be phased out over 5 years. The slaves were going to have to serve an apprenticeship, and after that they would be set at liberty. But those who were born in the intervening period to a slave mother would be declared instantly free, because previously they'd followed this legal principle. It was also adhered to in the United States that the child shall in all situations follow the condition of the mother, as in if a child is born to a slave mother, he or she is also held in servitude, whereas if the mother is free, even if the father is in servitude, then the child is a free person. But anyway, they did manage to later on speed up and reduce that 5 years to 4 years. So, woo, that was that. Obviously, it certainly didn't mean that racism was over, or that people had socioeconomic equality in these colonies where many people were held in slavery. Some people in places like India vigorously objected to this outrageous imperialistic interference. The Royal Navy had been launching anti-slavery patrols beforehand. Eventually, the French joined them in this and trying to stop people enslaving others. But sometimes a slave ship would see the Royal Navy in the horizon and actually dump their cargo, i.e. people, overboard, who would usually drown before the Royal Navy could come along. But some ships carrying people as slaves were intercepted. The people were freed in Freetown, Sierra Leone. But some British people, well, black British people who will from Canada, from the Caribbean, have been sent to Sierra Leone, where they can be free in their ancestral continent. That was from around about 1800. The United States followed suit with Liberia, but that was really to distract attention from the whole idea of abolishing slavery. So he died only days after the bill was passed, but was elated that he'd managed to get that far. There are a number of other properties around London associated with William Wilberforce. You ought to see the film Amazing Grace, which is about him. Anyway, book online lessons with me in history and politics and religious studies, in English literature, English as a foreign language, French, law, and I'll be your tour guide in London when coronavirus is over. So yeah, watch my other channel, British Poesy, in which I declaim poetry and speak about it. Anything else to say about him? Yes, there's that college in the United States named in his honour. He's got a big statue of him up in Hull. So the various other sites to visit linked to him. Right, toodaloo.